to the United States, where I got a PhD in economics from the New School University in New York, which is known for heterodox economics. And then after a few years, he came back to Italy. His work deals especially with the issues related to widely speaking to economic development and development economics. So I will leave now the floor to Davide and his presentation. Thanks for coming and for joining our series. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. As it was said, the geography of discontent is a topic which has received a lot of attention. And the continuing interest for the topic is witnessed by the most recent, latest issue of the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society is devoted to the topic. And that number, there is also a paper by somebody you know well, Alessandra Faggian. And my purpose here is not to add anything to that topic, which has been carried on in several contributions. My purpose here is to go back to the very roots of the story and to insert some doubts about its validity in a certain sense, especially call into question the idea that there is a geographical explanation to discontent, and therefore question what is often recognized as the most interesting contribution of this literature. So I went back to the, to me, seems the seminal paper on the topic. Rodríguez-Pose in 2018 has this paper by the title, you see there, under the first quote, "The Revenge of the Places That Don't Matter and What to Do About It," and is a 2018 paper. So I'm going back to that paper and review it very carefully in terms of the concepts that he lays down. And as I said, to formulate in what I consider to be an appraisal, some critical, highlight some critical points. To support this kind of research presentation, I will have...
Parla un po' più vicino al microfono.
Adesso? Meglio? So to support the presentation, I've just written down a few slides, what used to be called slides, which should just focus the attention to the most important passages in this appraisal. So let's begin, and all of this is Rodríguez-Pose 2018. So all the quotes that you see are from that particular article. So we start from what I have written on top as what I call the geography of discontent main hypothesis. Now, it's not formulated in strict form, but it is very well summarized the crucial point in the sentence which follows, which comes from the abstract of the paper published in 2018 by Andrés Rodríguez-Pose. So just let's go over that very quickly. Poor development process, so I will go over so that you can follow it, because it's important to pay attention to, as I said, to the language and the steps for the provisional conclusion that I'm going to present. Poor development prospect and an increasing belief that these places, the places that don't matter, have no future as economic dynamism has been posited to be increasingly dependent on agglomeration economies, so large cities in the first place, have led many of these so-called places that don't matter to revolt against the status quo. The revolt has come from an unexpected source, the ballot box, in a wave of political populism with strong territorial rather than social foundations. So the territory over the social is the key point of the hypothesis. The consequence, which also gives perspective to what Rodríguez-Pose is really talking about, which is a political question, in my opinion, is that this revolt, this rise of populism, has a very serious problem. This political and territorial conflict threatens to derail the very economic and social stability of the heart of the prosperity of the most dynamic cities and regions. So it's threatening the prosperity of the most dynamic cities and regions. So it's not that we are concerned about the places that don't matter just because we are good Samaritans. We are concerned because this has an implication which runs the risk to undermine economic and social stability. Very big problem, very serious problem indeed. Future economic growth and development at the country level and in the most prosperous region is being jeopardized by the revenge of the places that don't matter. So, indeed, a very serious problem. So let's examine how this argument is built. And again, I will follow closely what Rodríguez-Pose says. Let's see if no, mi ha detto che bastava spingere perché si sposta. Ah, sì, eccolo qua. Ecco. So he begins with a critical assessment of urban economics, mainstream urban economics, we could add. In fact, here I say the dominant narrative comes from what is somewhat loosely defined with urban economics. This is Richard Pose. This loosely defined is me, because indeed, urban economics is the field which has, a mainstream, and there are some critical approaches. So to say urban economics means to indicate the field rather than indicating the more specifically research programs in conclusion. So what are these? The dominant narrative is based to two things. One, large agglomerations are the main engine of growth. And I stress that by saying in very simple language, big cities are economic development. And here we have a controversial evidence that is presented by Richard Pose. So the question is, isn't this emphasis on the city-centered notion of unbalanced, because it's unbalanced development, the key of an increasing divide between places that don't matter and places that do matter? So let's consider the evidence that Richard Pose provides. So that's what I intend by this first controversial evidence. So large cities like London, New York, Paris, Tokyo, and Singapore are indeed doing very well. They showed resilience and adaptability to the economic crisis. They attract people and leading firms belonging to finance, high-tech, and digital sectors. The benefits of agglomeration economy seems to be positively correlated with the size of the city, which seems to matter more than ever. So that in the United Kingdom, for example, London has performed better than Manchester or Birmingham. And they have performed better than Liverpool or Sheffield. In France, Paris outperformed Lyon that has done better than Lille and Marseille. In Central and Eastern Europe, economic dynamism is that of the capital cities, which combine size with economic and political power. However, here is the controversial aspect. There are plenty of once dominant cities that have suffered sharp or gradual economic declines. Some are decaying industrial hubs. Example range from the United States, Detroit, St. Louis, and Youngstown, or to Guian, Jikun, and Lanzhou in China, or Dnipropetrovsk, in Ukraine. Or there are cities which have lost to competitors which were at the beginning of the competition smaller. So that's example of Montreal versus Toronto, Calcutta versus Mumbai, Los Angeles relative to San Francisco. Furthermore, medium and small size cities, I think medium and small size cities have become an important source of economic dynamics for an increasingly larger number of countries due to a series of factors that include a better quality of life, greater skills, improvements in accessibility. Well, this applies to the first world, to the developed world. Whereas in Africa, he predominantly speaks of Africa, Richard Pose speaks predominantly of Africa, the city don't seem to have the same capacity of acting as economic growth. Thus, the first fundamental distinction. The question of the narrative in which agglomeration economies and therefore cities are the driving force of economic growth applies to the first world, to the development, not necessarily to the developing countries. So, in conclusion, this controversial evidence, since there are several cities which are not doing so well, though in general cities and large cities are doing economically well, so there is a lot to, using his words, of a lot of evidence challenging the urban economics view that large agglomerations are the main engines of growth. Some cities are, some cities aren't. So that's the question of the controversial evidence number one. Let's move to the second central point of the narrative coming from urban economics. Economic development needs to be unbalanced. Development needs polarization in space. And here again, the evidence is controversial. So let's begin with the story of the reduction of disparities between 1992 and 2012. Most of the reduction has been concentrated in developed and middle-income countries. Greater polarization is, by contrast, in evidence in Africa, Eastern Europe, and large part of South Asia. Now, there is a discussion about the very question of development. Does development need or needs not polarization to be effective? But aside from that, what Richard Rodríguez-Pose wants to bring home is a point which he concluded he considers non-controversial, which is that territorial polarization may be resulting, and the question behind is polarization ultimately leading to a more inclusive society, or is it the root of the problem? So we have answered in a contradictory way, because we have seen examples in which polarization, especially in the, there's been a reduction in disparities, especially in the developed world, as I said. What is Richard Pose regards as undeniable, as I just said, is that the dynamism of many areas in the developed world has been contrasted with the lack of development in other areas. As simple as that. So polarization, although bringing a certain amount of convergence especially in the developed world. He says, polarization has resulted in territorial inequalities in many parts of the world. Economic openness benefited cities like Bangkok, the coastal provinces of China, many western and southern states in India. That prosperity, however, exacerbated territorial inequalities, penalizing the rural areas of Thailand, the internal regions of China, the northern and eastern states of India. In Europe, although disparities are in general less evident, increased economic growth has concentrated between 1990 and 2014 in a few countries: Ireland, Estonia, Luxembourg, Poland, Slovakia, and in a few cities: Bucharest, Budapest, Helsinki, Ljubljana, Madrid. The south of England, South Germany, Copenhagen, and Paris have also done relatively well. But low growth has been instead the norm in Bulgaria, eastern and southern areas of Hungary, most of East Germany, central Greece, southern Italy, the south of Portugal, with the exception of Algarve. And in the industrial declining regions of northeastern France, northwestern Italy, and northern Czech Republic. So again, there is a controversial evidence about this other important second pillar of the dominant narrative, the fact that economic development is imbalanced, is polarized in space. Maybe yes, maybe it's indispensable, maybe not. But what we observe is that certain polarizations benefited certain regions, but at the same time has penalized others. So in that sense, it's controversial. Before we go on, I thought it was necessary to say a few things about, so I'll call this a note, which is at the end of this slide. Okay. Now, I want to call your attention to the fact that all this discussion concern development, the phenomenon of economic development, and its spatial dimension. Development takes place in space and therefore has spatial consequences. Unbalance, territorial polarization, is needed for development to proceed. This is the dominant narrative. This is the dominant economic theory, I would say. Ensuing resulting territorial inequalities, regional, therefore, giving rise to what we could synthetically call regional uneven development, will be corrected in a second stage. That's the idea of mainstream development theory. First, you develop certain regions, then there will be convergence and development will spread out. So neoclassical economics relies on market mechanism, So this is the neoclassical economics reliance on market mechanism to correct regional disparities. So polarization is needed because then there will be a process of progressive homogenization. That's the optimistic view of urban economics. Territorial imbalance will be corrected by factors movement responding to price differentials. That's the hardcore of the entire story. If there is overabundant labor in a region underdeveloped, there will be a developed region where labor may become eventually scarce. So the price of labor in the underdeveloped regions is low, and the price of labor in the developed regions is high. Therefore, since people read economic signals and they are rational agents, they will recognize that the rational behavior is to move to the developed regions where they can win better wages. Therefore, there will be a balancing of the factor concerning the factor, the production factor labor, so that eventually labor will become scarce in the underdeveloped region and the price will go up. And so there will be no more incentive to move out of the what used to be the underdeveloped region. And there will be a kind of leveling off of the level of wages between the two regions. So factors movement responding to price differential will tend to recreate an equilibrium. So development may need to be polarized at the beginning, but that through this movement, if they are not impeded, there will be a tendency for a reequilibration mechanism. That's the bottom line of the story, which is behind the optimistic view of urban economics. Okay. Okay, now let's get to the more critical part. I mean, what is most important for the argument that I want to present. So let me return to what seems uncontroversial is that polarization has resulted in territorial inequalities. And here again, quoting Rodríguez-Pose, hence a number of territories across the world are being left behind, experiencing long periods of decline. A geography of discontent is emerging. We get to the topic that we want to examine. Notice he quotes Roderick, 2017, by saying, what arouses popular opposition, discontent, therefore, is not inequality per se, but perceived unfairness. So it's not the comparing me poor to you rich. I become discontent. I'm become discontent because I feel to be penalized because I have no prospect to improve my position. That's the problem with the cities and regions, with the places that don't matter. They revolt because they feel that they have no perspective. And it's not so much the inequality question. Rodríguez-Pose returned to this question several times, but this sense that inequality is not inequality per se, but the perceived unfairness of the condition of the places that don't matter. So the revenge of the places that don't matter is the surge of populism. In recent decades, it has emerged as a political phenomenon in many parts of the world. But notice, but it is particularly in poor or declining areas where it has taken hold. Now, this seems fairly obvious, but we will see how this has important consequences, which are kind of, you kind of lose them as you go along with the argument, which, as I said at the beginning, the very focus of Rodríguez-Pose is political, is the question of populism. But in that, pursuing that goals, I'm going to suggest, he loses track of a couple of things that I want to point out. Let me conclude. We could then go into the discussion of populism, which is a very complicated question that I'm not going to discuss because that's not my particular focus, except for noticing that Rodríguez-Pose necessarily talks in populism in general terms. And because he brings in the populism which ranges from Thailand to United States. Now, it may be true that in this area, populist parties have represented the voice of those who don't matter. But the variety of populism and the complexity of the very notion of populism, think simply to the idea of distinguishing between right-wing and left-wing populism. If you need right-wing and left-wing, why then how can populism be in a political category that solves the problem, which should solve the problem? But in any case, all of this is a complicated matter in my argument here, only to remind you of how much this aspect, which is difficult, as I said, to define, is central to Rodríguez-Pose's argument, whereas I think he loses track of a couple of things that I'm going to point out in a moment. But he says that the phenomenon was unexpected because the judgment of social scientists and politicians as well, academics and politicians, has been clouded by a few misunderstandings. So he sorts out four main reasons. And that's interesting because that's a criticism of the received discourse. First of all, mainstream academia has been looking at the wrong types of externalities. Let me go over all of them, and then I'll say something about each of them. Then mainstream academia has been ignoring one important form of inequality, which is territorial inequality. It's concentrated on income inequality. It's concentrated on disparities in economic conditions. Third, has overestimated the capacity and willingness of the individuals to move. This is direct criticism to the equilibrating mechanism that I've described, so that development from one region can spread to the other one just by means of mobility. Well, he says there's been an overestimation of the capacity and willingness of individuals to move. You may think that in the city the wages are higher, but there are reasons for which that it may not be enough for you indeed to move. And lastly, he says that mainstream academia has been overlooking or dismissing the economic potential of many lagging behind regions, areas. As to say, they have not understood the potential which is there, so they have given up these areas because they would not be capable of development, simply because they have not been able to identify this economic potential. So let me just say a few things about each of these. So looking at the wrong types of negative externalities, it took me a while to understand this, because think of an urban environment. What are the typical negative externalities? They're connected to pollution, congestion, and things of this sort. So if you look at the question about the question of cities and non-cities, you see cities with this problem, which is an externality problem, which is not present in the other places, which are not cities, strictly speaking, which, however, have the problem of not being developed. So what are the wrong types of negative externalities? Well, I think it is somewhat difficult to understand, but what Rodríguez-Pose means is that the real cost of development, and therefore the negative externalities of development of cities, is the lack of development that imposes on the other areas. So it's a little contrived reasoning. We simply says that because I am developed, because of that, I impose a cost, a negative externality on the areas which are not developed. So in that sense, indeed, mainstream academia was looking at the wrong types of externality, concentrated on the negative externalities which are created by urban concentration, typically congestion, pollution, and so on. And has overlooked the fact that the main damage, although it treats that in terms of an externality, the main damage created by that urban development is imposing the lack of development on the other areas which are not developed. So to me, this is in a way, an ingenious way to call attention to the problem of uneven development. Because the cost is not pollution, but is the fact that because I develop, you don't develop. But at the same time, it's really contrived to, because you are talking about externalities, in terms of externalities, something which can be dealt with conceptually in a different way. Okay, the second point, ignoring the important form of inequality. Well, that concerns space and territorial differences, indeed geography. And he insists on the fact, to prove the point, Rodríguez-Pose goes back to the populistic vote, noting that there is little evidence that interpersonal inequality played a decisive role. That's quite interesting. It's not me poor comparing to you poor, which drives discontent. And to prove that, to disprove the idea that is economic inequality driving the discontent, eventually resulting in the populist vote, is the fact that he picks, interesting, the example of cities like New York, Philadelphia. No, that's another thing. No, he picks the city, picks the example of global cities, New York, Tokyo, Paris, maybe, and so on, to say, look, these cities have voted, that's something we were talking about before. They all voted for not populistic. So even the lower classes in these global cities have not become populist, which means that not economic inequality, but something else is determining discontent. Therefore, something which has to do with geography. Therefore, ignoring one important form of inequality, territorial inequality, implies that the comparison of income between interpersonal comparative income is not terribly important. And okay, instead, mainstream academia has ignored this important form of inequality, which is territorial inequality. But we need to say more precisely what territorial inequality is, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Well, the overestimating the capacity or willingness to individual is an interesting topic, which we have been discovering that people don't move so easily away from the place where they have built their house, they have their parents, they have their relatives, they have their social networks and all that. So it's not that you simply move to the cities because there is a higher possibility of employment, higher wages, yes. But that's not enough of a pulling factor. It's important, but you then don't, again, mainstream academia has overestimated the willingness of the individual to move simply based on the simple economic incentives that I have mentioned before. And near the last point, overlooking and dismissing the economic potential of many lagging behind regions. Yeah, indeed. There has been little way to consider this kind of potential. But again, what is this kind of potential? Because you can claim that there's been overlooking, dismissing the economic potential, but then you come to the point, what is the economic potential of places which are not cities? So the story goes back to what we have heard over and over again the last 10, 15, 20 years. Tourism, local products, local initiatives, small scale manufacturing. Well, I'll return to that in the last part of the argument. So these are the 4 points, and these are the comments that I've made. Now let's get to what I consider most important, the revenge of geography. So the revenge of territorial inequalities in a sense, and its limits. What are the limits? So this revenge of geography seems to be based on 3 factors. Let's consider the first one, the urban-rural divide. By rural, I mean urban in terms of cities or large cities, and urban, rural in the sense of less urban and rural cities. So this divide is indeed an important factor to explain discontent and its association with populism. However, we have in the evidence that we have examined, provided by Rodríguez-Pose, we have seen that in his own words, there is no strict association of populism with less urban sites as opposed to large cities. The evidence is controversial. So you cannot conclude that urban-rural divide is the explanation for populism because the evidence is not there, according to what he says. Cities, and here I go over the argument a little bit, are not in their majority populist. It's true. That again has to do with the controversial evidence. But what is non-controversial is that those who are definitely in their majority populist are declining industrial areas and lesser urban or rural marginalized areas in his own language. So it's not urban rural strictly speaking, but it's decline those where the majority of the areas where populism is very strong are definitely either declining industrial areas or lesser urban or rural marginalized areas. In fact, using his own words, they are less developed or declining areas. So, or lagging behind or declining areas. I'm repeating twice the words that he used. So they are either areas which are in decline, they have been industrialized and now they're in decline, or they are cities, they are areas, sorry, that are lagging behind. They've not developed. So lack of development or development going bad, declining industrial development. Therefore, the territorial roots rather than urban-rural divide of populism are in areas of economic decline. I repeat, but this has to be absolutely clear, otherwise we don't understand the sort of tentative conclusion that I'm going to propose. The areas of economic decline and the lagging behind or less developed areas. So that's the story of discontent as defined by Rodríguez-Pose himself. So this has to do with the urban and rural divide, which per se is not sufficient. Then, second question, territorial inequality. Again, I repeat on top, is not interpersonal inequality that what triggers discontent beyond the populist vote, rather territorial inequality. However, territorial inequality is rooted in an economic disadvantage condition. That's clear. In economic disadvantage condition, which is either defined, which can be defined by low income and lack of development opportunities and prospects. And that's true. These particular economic characteristics, disadvantage economic conditions in terms of, let me repeat, low income or lack of development, which may to some extent be the same thing, is specific to certain territories. True, is manifested in certain territories more than others. But what about an independent role of geography? No, because lack of development, poverty or decline have altogether other causes than geography. It's not geography which determines lack of development, poverty or decline. So there is no autonomous role of geography. It's true that geography points out at the places where certain phenomena, economic disadvantage conditions, are located. Certain phenomena specifically lack of development, poverty, or decline, are specific to certain territories. But that has nothing to do with any independent role of geography. The autonomous role of geography, and that's the key point, appears reasonable, appears interesting, not only for all the very interesting things that Rodríguez-Pose says about urban development in general, but because this particular strong correlation with the association with populism. But the association with populism is an association which I said, and we could go deeper into that. It's an association which is very complex to define because populism has many, many facets. He himself says a new phenomenon with many, many aspects. So how can you possibly explain phenomena which are fundamentally economic development problems, development or not development, in terms, and which are specific to certain territories? You can explain that discontent created by this particular disadvantaged economic condition as a geographical root only because you associate that with populism. But populism is itself a very complicated topic to define. So to conclude, sort of conclude. So going back to development and urban economics, discontent and resentment are associated with territorial inequalities. Yes. The real and perceived unfairness is territorial in the sense of being specific to certain places. However, underneath this absurd phenomenon to which geography gives the surface, the picture, the photography, is the dynamics of uneven regional development, a well-known problem in the analysis of development, although often forgotten. Uneven regional development means, outside mainstream urban economics, the problem is no mystery at all. You don't need, as I say at the last sentence, you don't need to talk about externalities in order to explain the cost of development being the lack of development in other areas, because the two phenomena are linked to one another. Because outside mainstream economics, which relies in this equilibrating mechanism which I've described, factors movement, responding to price differential, and the example that I've used is that of the movement of labor and wage differential. Well, outside mainstream economics, which relies in this optimistic view of equilibrating mechanism, the problem is no mystery at all, because development coexists and actually causes underdevelopment. There is a link between the two aspects. That's the point of uneven regional development. So if you look at the problem raised by Rodríguez-Pose, in this perspective, his argument becomes more interesting because in the framework of a general process, stays away from mainstream urban economics that he wants to criticize, and indeed gives an explanation which is not territorial inequality, is an economic condition which is either declining, development gone bad, or lack of development, areas, regions which have been marginalized by the process of development. These phenomena are economic in nature, and they take a territorial geographic dimension. But it's not geography that drives uneven regional development. It's development which drives territorial inequalities. That's important to be kept in mind, and is somewhat lost in the reasoning that Rodríguez-Pose presented, precisely because he relies very much on the association with a political phenomenon which is difficult to define for his own admission. So it's true, the populism may be an expression of discontent, but the causes of discontent are in a disadvantaged economic condition, which is identified territorially, but is dependent on a mechanism which is that of uneven regional development, which is no mystery if you're outside that equilibrating mechanism. Quite the opposite, because one implies the other. So no need of externalities to explain differences in development, because it's not a matter of externality, it's a matter of a systemic link between development and underdevelopment. Therefore, it would be possibly the best way to look at what Rodríguez-Pose has brought to our attention and all the literature on the geography of discontent in a different perspective, that of regional unequal regional development, because that can comprehend the entire story. And you don't need the discourse about populism. That phenomenon has been around since the beginning of development. In 1974, the Review of Radical Political Economics had an entire issue, fat issue, about unequal regional development. The problem is that that particular approach has fallen out of consideration because people are too much versed in urban economics, traditional mainstream urban economics, as Rodríguez-Pose says. And he brings back the problem, but he's not getting to the roots of the problem. In my opinion, it seems that a lot of what he says in terms of the regional city development and the controversial aspect that he quite carefully examines can be better understood by taking an approach which has a different theoretical perspective, the one which I just said. Just to conclude, I have focused on this article because the fundamental hypotheses of the geography of discontent are quite spelled out with a lot of care. And all the literature which has followed has basically followed these insights in this seminal paper by Rodríguez-Pose. They have contributed adding new variables to the discussion, but the dependent variable is always populism. So you can improve the analysis by adding elements and testing them with an econometric model. But the dependent variable remains discontent measured by the vote to populist parties. Therefore, you don't go beyond what Rodríguez-Pose says. That's why I insisted, because I think the fundamentals are laid out in that article. So especially very suggestive, interesting perspective like the one he presented need to be very carefully examined, as I've tried to show you, because in between the lines, well, not in between the lines, but if you read carefully what he said, you realize what the article is really saying. So the importance, and this goes back to at the very beginning, Rodríguez-Pose, as a social scientist, is very concerned about the fact that what he considers, I think, obviously bad, the fact that people vote populist parties, is running the risk through discontent and protest to undermine the prosperity and the stability of economic development, which is taking place in the cities. So his argument in this sense, in my opinion, is fundamentally political, directed to political elites, telling them, look, these people are discontent, and for good reasons. If you don't want them to vote wrong, so to vote undemocratic populist parties, because obviously I think that seems to me the political framework in which you can put the fundamental problem that Rodríguez-Pose want to present us. Well, if you don't want them to vote wrong, then you have to address this question. In fact, the title says at the beginning, the places that don't matter and what to do about them is a call of attention to politicians and social scientists to say, look, if you don't want them to vote wrong, within quotes, if you don't want them for parties which have a feeble relationship to liberal democracy as we know it, then you have to address the problem. You have to look at this problem. And he is probably right. But he also saying these elites, look, it's not because, as I said at the beginning, we are good Samaritans, but because otherwise this discontent, the protest against the status quo can undermine the stability and the force of economic development where it's taking place, namely in major urban areas. So you have to be careful because this may come back to you in a way that you won't like. And that seems to be the major point that he wants to argue. But for that major point, if you don't want to get into discussion on liberal democracy or populism, you have to have clear that there is no independent role of geography in this geography of discontent. And this is rarely noted in the literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gualerzi. Thank you for your talk and your critical reading, particularly of this seminal piece article by Andrés Rodríguez-Pose that we hosted. I think was the first series of our seminar series. It was right during the lockdown period. I think we hosted Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, albeit virtually, in which in a seminar in which he presented his thesis on the socio-spatial roots of populism. I partly agree or disagree with your critical reading. I think Rodríguez-Pose identified a number of issues that in a way are quite appropriate for understanding these contemporary dynamics of economic and regional polarization, the fact that some superstar cities attract a lot of resources at the expense of the other cities and the other regions. I think it was a very good idea which he developed. Also, his critique of a lot of urban economics literature has been based on the presupposition, on the assumption that there is a mobility of highly skilled workers and firms and technology firms towards some places. And Rodríguez-Pose emphasized the fact that mobility cannot be such a central explanation for economic development in one way or another. But I think it's an interesting debate. I think the Italian context has a lot of specific characteristics that are a bit different from those of United States, where there is a quite strong polarization between big cities, especially coastline cities, which specialize in technology advanced economies on the other hand, and remote regions, rural areas and inner states, which became the strongholds of the Trump revenge. And the same perhaps in the UK. Like in the United States, there was an alliance between racial minorities, black voters, and white middle class and upper class. So while in Italian cities, like Milan, like Turin, like Rome, there was a polarized vote between central areas in which people, more affluent voters, voted for more mainstream parties like Partito Democratico, and more peripheral areas like the suburbs, where the lower classes live, in Turin, in Rome, in Milan, they voted for these so-called populist parties like the League, like Fratelli d'Italia, like the Five-Star Movement at the time. So perhaps I think what is missing perhaps in Rodríguez-Pose piece is a kind of, I think, more wide-ranging focus on different geographical articulations of the populist phenomenon, which are very different, I think, and came from, for instance, between the UK and Italy. So there are also commonalities, but there are also, so perhaps the geography part understood as differences between countries and different contexts is missing in his analysis as well. By the way, that is my reading, and I would invite you from the floor to make questions and observations. Please, Alessandra.
There are other ways that maybe you can, now I don't need to shout, otherwise. So on that one, I agree. I also agree with Ugo about, well, Andrés obviously did a good job, but he's lacking a little bit more focused on the different geographical context. So for instance, you were talking about the differences in voting, past minister and populist, between the rural and urban areas. You can compare the US and Italy. We had some work with Giulia, Marco, and other people here, where indeed we don't find a difference if you look at more peripheral versus more central area. It's more like a long historical pattern. So we see differences between Tuscany and Veneto. So just to take two examples, but it has nothing to do with whether they are peripheral, ultra peripheral, or intermediate areas. So we don't see that. In the US, it's a completely different thing. So it works very well if you talk about voting Trump. It doesn't work nearly as well when you talk about Italy. So you can't really draw any kind of conclusion that applies to all the different geographical contexts. So that I get. What I disagree though, and I just don't get it, and that's why I want to ask you this question, what do you mean by geography? Because as a regional scientist, regional economist, stroke economic geography, because at some point I've been also in a geography department, when we talk about the geography of discontent, or with Daria, we had the geography of hatred because we were looking at hate events in Italy. What we mean is spatial distribution of something, right? So when you say geography doesn't matter because it's a matter of uneven regional development, isn't that what economic geography is about? And so things like location, agglomeration, accessibility. So uneven regional development in Italy, well, the north and the south are very different, but the south is less accessible than the north. It's less central, it's less close to the core. That to me, it's uneven regional development, but it's an issue of economic geography, stroke regional economics, regional science, because space is in there. So one of the reasons I departed from mainstream economics was exactly that there was no role of space whatsoever. And I had to move closer to geography to actually find somebody that would study seriously the role of space in all the economics phenomena. You are also right that the causality goes either way, but indeed it goes both ways. It's not just economics, it's not just development. There are very strong spatial features, which I call geography of. So I'm not sure what you mean when you say geography doesn't matter. What do you mean by geography?
Thanks, Alessandra. Anyone else? Fabiano? No. Boris. Boris Ceselak is...
But maybe you would like to respond first to Alessandra, and then I'll ask.
We can collect one more question and then he's a PhD student of first year. Yes. Please.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I have to say that really liked it. I really find interesting how you expand or how you notice the what Rodríguez-Pose puts as a negative externality, like an euphemism, which to him seems a bit new. If you have a bit of heterodox reading, it's not that surprising. And as we say that there is nothing new under the sun, if we think of capitalism and the drivers of capital accumulation, it's always contingent on production of scarcity, or if you want to be more extreme, on exploitation. From the enclosure of the commons through colonies and extraction of resources, slavery, cheap labor, through exploitation of nature, and then structural adjustments in the 80s, it's always development to a big extent contingent on the production of scarcity. So I really like how you link these two together. The thing I find a bit problematic in general in the reading of economic development papers is the conflation of growth and economic development with prosperity, and a bit of problem of conflating the places with people with agency. If we think that some places like New York or London are growing, are doing pretty well, and then there are the places which are left behind, we do a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. In a sense, who is benefiting in the cities? Who is having a good life and benefiting from growth in London? And I would bet some money that the working class, so to speak, in New York is not really doing that well, not benefiting from the economic growth that we see here. So that are all my comments. I just really like that you point these things out of the Rodriguez paper.
I'm sorry to say that because of your mask, I couldn't quite understand what you're asking. So I will ask.
Perhaps can you repeat just the question? Yeah.
No, I wasn't really asking. I was just kind of saying that I like how you pointed out a couple of things.
Yeah, but what about New York? What will you say? Well, you'd say something specific about New York, London?
Yeah, about New York, London, I said that if we speak of the growth in places and that New York and London are doing super well, and there are places which are left behind, we commit a bit of a fallacy of misplaced concreteness, in the sense that we think that a place is people, and the question is who is benefiting, who is having a good life in London, and due to the economic growth. So there's a lot to still unpack in our theorization of uneven development or development as such.
Okay. Should I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, precisely because economic development, since Hirschman would dedicate the last chapter in his book 1958 as spatial features, precisely because of that, you cannot say, I would argue, that there is an independent role of geography. Development takes place in space. Geography has to do with space. And because of that, economic phenomena have territorial characteristics, spatial features. So I don't see much of the problem in keeping the two things separate. And I agree fully that one way in which mainstream economic theory is deficient is not having considered space. A space began to be considered by geographies and later by localization theory and all of that. And it was then brought to the perfection by regional science, which says quite simply, in our equation, general equilibrium equation, we add a variable, which is space. How do we add the variable? Through transportation cost. And then you have a perfect general equilibrium model in which you have a space for space through transportation cost. But then, of course, that's complicated by, especially by agglomeration economy, by the agglomeration economies, by the kind of localized economies which are important according to different industry. All of that. I mean, I'm not arguing against that process, that line of thinking in regional studies. What I'm simply saying is that Richard Pose, with claiming that is not perceived inequality, but lack of fairness, is not interpersonal comparison of income, but rather the sense in which you feel cut off. Well, it points out of elements which are territorially, geographically located, but in that way, it seems to suggest that there is an autonomous role of geography, which I would say is important to identify where phenomena takes place, indeed the spatial dimension, but they cannot provide a explanation of the underlying mechanism. That's what I'm saying. It's fairly simple. But since he's so successful for very good reasons, we want to have clear what he's saying. And the strong part of his discourse has to do with the association with the populism. But all of us, himself in the first place, agrees that populism is a very complicated matter. So we want to be careful about assessing that geography determines discontent and then populism, because what determines discontent, in his own words, are two things: declining urban regions, industrial hubs, the story that we know from the deindustrialization of America, 1982, Bluestone and Harrison book, the deindustrialization of America. And we have been seeing happening all over the world, for in general, or lack of development, which means not being able to activate that potential of lagging behind regions that he says without making recourse to the narrative of agglomeration. That's all what I'm saying, that these are the two topics, not geography per se, but I have no issue at all with the fact that economic development has definite important spatial features. And indeed, as he says, as I have made think for maybe not so clear in the presentation, territory is extremely important because you go and see where the things happen, So, and that's very important because from the particularity, you can go to the big picture. So being one who studied urban planning, I learned that it's extremely important to go to the place and see things. So I could not be more in agreement with the development having spatial features. But if you want to get to the bottom of the story, as he says, is a matter of declining industrial areas and lagging behind regions. That's the point. And this is the language of Richard Pose. But he likes better to explain all of this in terms of a discourse about populism, which is in a way difficult to articulate. And as I said, because in the end, he wants to send a political message to the liberal democratic elites. That's my understanding. Careful, because these people are discontent, but we have to go and take care of them, because otherwise this story comes full circle back undermine the process of development of cities and the process of development where you, liberal democratic elites, are, si dice in Italiano, insediate, you're settled. It seems to me that that is the political problem. And in doing that, I simply argued that he is not stressing enough, although he said it because that's the purpose of my textual reconstruction. He says that the problem is, let me repeat, industrial declining region, lagging behind region. These are economic problems which have to do with development and its spatial features, indeed. Now, coming to the other story. Well, I understand that you seem to have liked what I said, so which is fine. In terms of New York and London, as I said, one of the things which has really struck me is Richard Rodríguez-Pose talks about the similarity in the voting pattern against populism of major global cities. Now, in major global cities, if you have spent any time in one of them, you realize that there are the really international elites for question of real estate, of investment, or whatever you want to look at the problem, from which angle you want to see the problem, which lives side by side with the very large mass of servants, often immigrants, who serves their needs and their industries. The industries meaning, well, restaurants, entertainment, and so on. So it's true that it is a paradox because they have voted the same way. There is no populism in New York, and Rodríguez-Pose points out to something which is a feature which I found very interesting, although limited as relevance. So the people were very different social status, vote in the same direction. But the paper I'm writing about this is also providing an indication of why that happens. And this is not something which is scientifically sounded, it just is the consequence of reflection. It's true that these cities offer incredible employment opportunities to low-level, low-skill workers, precisely because of the place where the elites are, international elites. So in a sense, there is a reason why the servants are voting together with the elites, because they have an opportunity they would not have in many other, even large cities. But that's just a tentative explanation. And to conclude, but you're right about pointing out, as Saskia Sassen in a paper, early paper, the first time I met her, we were talking about mid-80s, she says the peripherization in the core. There are lots of features of the periphery in the core, in the sense of very low skill, low paid jobs, or what I've called provocatively servants. So it's true that these cities are socially very mixed and different, and then coexist aspect that she called marginalization, she called peripherization within the core, within the very core cities of development, namely she was talking about New York. So these two aspects can coexist.
Any other questions? One brief question on my side as well. I want to, in a way, criticize your point that everything is about uneven regional development. If we look at the map of populist votes in Italy, and I think it's not related to long-standing dynamics of uneven regional development. Well, my assumption is that it's not a five-star movement in Italy that is illustrative of populist vote, because I think it's they were voted essentially for their income, reddito di cittadinanza, citizenship income, but I think it's more the league that is representative of populist vote in Italy, and So in Italy, the regions that embrace this populist backlash were not the poorest regions, like Calabria. Well, there were some people voting for the League even there, but there were more regions in center-east Italy, like Marche, like Umbria, perhaps Abruzzo itself was reached by this wave. So this has not to do with the long-standing dynamics of north versus south of uneven regional development, but it tells us about new dynamics of regional inequalities affecting regions that were relatively prosperous in previous years, like along the Adriatic coast, were specializing in small and medium firms, and were representative of the post-Fordist economy. So perhaps it's the post-Fordist economy in the Italian context that is in crisis. So this populist phenomenon in Italy has to do not much with the traditional uneven regional development, but with the crisis of post-Fordist economies. In Umbria, in Marche especially, the so-called linea adriatica dello sviluppo, the Adriatic line of local economic development. Any other questions? You answer to me? Questions, please.
Please, questions.
Okay, you can start from mine.
Now, I don't see any contrast. I'm talking about Rodríguez-Pose talks about the world. So in that framework, I say that the dynamic of regional uneven development is the key, is the question which unifies territorial aspect and economic dynamics. So I'm talking about the same level of generality. Now, if you go down the more specific issues, then the specificities of countries, of regions, and of populism come into the picture. But I'm not interested, as I said at the beginning, to contribute to the discussion of populism. I'm interested in contributing to the discussion of the spatial aspects of development. Now, of course, having identified, as I tend to agree, with declining areas, industrial dismissing, falling apart areas, and lack of development areas, the keys of discontent, leaving aside the representation with the populism, I have an easy time to come to terms with what you are saying, because Marche are, for example, a region, for the little I know, that have experienced a very significant industrial decline. Merloni, when I took the course at Istituto Adriano Olivetti at the end of the 70s, was a star in the Italian industrial system. It's gone. So there is no, I'm simply pointing out at the two general features which are indeed bringing us to the question of regional inequalities and issue of discontent, leaving aside how much that discontent is representing the populism, simply because populism is very multifaceted, complicated matter. For example, just let me say something of this which is rather obvious. So let's come to the Italian context. Let's forget about Trump or non-Trump in the United States, Brexit or remain, Brexit or remain in UK, which are the example that Rodríguez-Pose uses. And let's come to Italy. There is plenty of political scientists which are explaining that populism is something which can be relabeled in Italy. The two parties that are usually populist party in Italy, Lega and Fratelli d'Italia. Well, in my understanding, at least one of them has very clear right-wing roots. So populism may be a new vest, but ideologically, they're very clearly located. The question is more difficult for La Lega. But then another element of confusion in terms of a general argument about populism, but clarification when you come down from the level general, theoretical, you go to the specificities of countries, regions, and territories. Therefore, Marche as a level example of region, or Veneto, or any other place. Well, you can discover that the other complexity for the Italian populists is that this five-star movement is populist, but does not enter the calculation of the populist vote, not in general. And I mean, without any intention to say something for which I have no proof and done no analysis, it's clear that the five-star movement is something which made a lot of different things. So maybe populism applies to them precisely because they fight very much against the idea of being right-wing or left-wing. But political scientists have argued several times that in certain cases, it's very clear the association of populism with right-wing politics, and Fratelli d'Italia seems to be a clearest example. So if you go down and then in the analysis of the many aspects of regional development, but also populism, and you go down from the general level, region, specificity, territories, then you look into these things and you get answers that at the general level you cannot get. So Rodríguez-Pose's argument can be read through the lenses of unequal regional development and the question of populism, which becomes specific as you go down from the general to the regional to the territory. Because after all, general ideas need to be supported in specific contexts, precisely because we have consideration for space and geography in the sense of defining territorial phenomena. That's what I think.
Thank you. Is assistant professor in economic and political geography here at the JSSI. Please, Julie.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. I just want to make a comment on your last answer, because we were quite working on populism, as Alessandra was saying, here at the JSSI. And actually, at the European level, also the five-star movement is classified indeed as a populist party. And in our works, we were actually seeing that both, actually, Italy is a very interesting case in point, because we have there in the same country the two shades of populism, which are acknowledged as being relevant in Europe, let's say. So the anti-establishment one and the anti-EU immigration one. One is Lega for Italy and the other one is Movimento 5 Stelle, five-star movement. And actually, Fratelli d'Italia doesn't really enter populist parties. As for the European classification, which is the same that was used by Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, for instance. Why am I saying that? Because in our work, we saw, for instance, that two very different geographies are relevant to explain populist votes for these two different populist parties. For instance, while for the five-star movement, there's a kind of north-south divide, it is still explicative, let's say, in explaining the geography of voting patterns. What Ugo was saying about Lega was found also in our work, meaning that, for instance, it was not really the urban-rural divide, doesn't really apply to Italy, because, for instance, in the case of Lega North, it was mainly outlying areas, meaning belt areas around cities, which voted for Lega. And this is interesting because, in a way, it goes in the opposite direction, related to what Andrés was saying, meaning that in some other works about resilience, for instance, to the Great Recession, resilience in the face of the Great Recession, we were seeing that there were exactly belt areas that resist more the Great Recession, which were, let's say, less impacted from it. And they were, in Italy, the ones that voted more, for instance, for populist parties like Lega. So I think that geography really matters in some way in explaining. I got your point in don't take geography as a deterministic factor, if this is your point, if I got it well, yes. But I think it still remains an explicative factor when we well explain what are the phenomena we are investigating, as you were actually saying. And just last point on your presentation, I didn't get well why you were saying that, for instance, there was no much of increase of knowledge after the paper by Rodríguez-Pose, because all literature was building on this paper and then using populist votes, the share of populist votes as a dependent variable, like we did, for instance. But if our interest is on populism, I can see which other variables should we use as dependent variable.
No,
thank you.
Yeah, I was saying that the article by Rodríguez-Pose set the agenda which has been pursued by the literature, which has tested and at times adding factors. So that's what I'm saying. I only insisted on the fact that if we want to see the fundamental hypothesis, well, that paper tells very much the story. And then other things, especially in terms of testing. Now, what you're saying, that's quite interesting. This adds something. If you can be able to discriminate the different votes, so you're already, see, that's the step forward. You're already splitting the idea of populism, and you look at parties which have different history and different historical and geographical roots. That's perfectly fine, and there's nothing to object to that. And therefore, that's a step forward, but is always inscribed within the story that Richard, I keep saying Richard, Rodríguez-Pose sets out. That's all what I'm saying. What you are discovering is quite a lot of interest to me. But again, think of, let's forget about Fratelli d'Italia, which to me seems to have a fairly clear political lineage. And let's just forget for a moment about the Five Stars movement, which again seems to me to be an expression of discontent towards this party system and towards, and you also remember, they proposed the citizenship income, and they had lots of votes in the South. So, but let me come to Lega and link to one of the questions that I've mentioned to be the key of the geographical features of the economic development, lagging behind regions and declining regions. Now, isn't La Lega well represented since it became 10 or 15 years ago a working class party expressing precisely the discontent, the problems, the uncertainty, the unfairness that the working class was feeling by being left out by the left when they were in fact in the places where industrial development, the development of the 50s, 60s and 70s was called into question. Rodríguez-Pose says one of the regions which collected discontent were some of the industrial regions of France and northwestern Italy, northern western Italy. That's where La Lega came from. So in a sense, it seems to me that though it's quite interesting to begin to split the idea, to see the electoral vote and to be connected to more specific parties and their geographical roots, it seems to me that nevertheless, if you take the case of the Lega, or the general discourse about economic decline says a lot of the threat of economic decline. At the same time, Veneto, which is northeast, third Italy, Bagnasco 1977, is discontent, but they are not a declining region. So that's something that we want to argue in another paper to be an outlier in the discourse about discontent and the geography of discontent.
Thanks for your answer. Any other question from Daria Denti? She's a postdoctoral researcher here at the JSI.
So I have a question on this. How do you measure it? That also relates to this thing of where is the political cleavage of this discontent? Okay, so my example is this one. Maybe you touched it before and I lost it. So if it's so, I apologize. But if you consider Brexit, so Brexit in the end, okay, there was the UKIP, but then it was also a big Tory political claim. And I don't think that we could be comfortable in defining the Tory party as like populist, strongly populist is a conservative one. But like, I mean, currently their political success is out of one of the most powerful manifestation of discontent, I would say. And this, but also people voting for Labour, they wanted the Brexit. So again, I think that this issue of how do you measure this discontent, because maybe now for every party being a little bit populistic matters just to have votes. So I think this raises another fundamental question that I don't think that a brand of a party now can actually fit so well in defining all them as populist or non-populist. So this is my question.
Yeah. Another question, we can collect it, otherwise.
Yeah, we have one additional here.
Margherita Grazioli is another postdoctoral researcher here.
Thanks for your presentation, and the topic is extremely timely, also given the historical period we are currently in. My question would be about the last aspect you touched upon, which is the notion of development. If you could unpack what you mean by development, because in my understanding, for instance, development also in the current debates about the National Plan of Recovery and Resilience is focused on some thresholds that often correspond to touristification often, or tourist development, or platformization, and often this kind of phenomena lead to great inequalities and also to widespread precarity. We've seen this even before the pandemic, and after and during the pandemic, we also saw how these models of development were inherently fragile because, for instance, they could not cope with the pandemic. And on top of that, this kind of development tends to favor, for instance, the fact that there are large segments of populations, regardless of being urban or non-urban, that are working poor, for instance, that suffer precarity. And then this would, for instance, explain also how electoral consensus was channeled towards, for instance, the five-star movement that was proposing a basic income that could fill this gap between being working poor and at least being able to cater for essential livelihood. So yeah, to sum up, my question was about what you mean by development specifically. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I would like to ask you a question again on development and namely on underdevelopment. You said that development coexists and causes underdevelopment, but by that, do you mean that there is no possibility to solve this coexistence, or do some kind of policies? For example, I'm thinking about place-based policies that could solve this discontent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, because it's pretty related to what Giulia was saying. Mostly being development pretty polarized, we are, as you are saying, we are somehow assuming that there must be a degrowth process in act in order for the lagging behind areas in order to develop. Otherwise, development could allow the coexistence of growth both in the core, let's say, and in the peripheries. Though this lexicon could not be the most appropriate, let's say. In this sense, are we somehow postulating degrowth in order for in the cores, in order for the for such other areas to develop?
Thanks. I didn't introduce the last two questions. Giulia Martinelli and Francesco Androni are PhD students, the first year here in our program. Thanks, Giulia and Francesco. Perhaps we can let you answer.
Okay.
To this,
so first question on top. Yeah, populism is a category which has been stretched in many directions. I think I made that clear. I stayed away from the debate. I'm not a political scientist. It's so to offer a very illuminating point of view from that perspective, it was not my main purpose. But yes, I think it's been stretched. I think it was fairly clear. It's stretched into many directions to become at times including things which can be better identified. But that has to do with the political debate, with the political torsion, the ideological torsion. Everybody wants to stay away from right and left. No? Now, five-star movements, we are no right, no left. And would you think that people, well, some parties do like to say we come from a very specific background. Fratelli d'Italia is fairly clear about that in Italy. So welcome. Let's understand what are the ideological and political roots. And I think I take very well your suggestion that Remain and Brexit had to do a lot with the Tories going a certain direction. But you recall that that worked. And Brexit was a Tories argument because the Labour Party could not take a position. They were stuck. And even the new leadership by Mr. what's his name, who now is in disgrace. What? Yeah, he could not understand whether going for the people's feelings, I don't know, for the popular movement, which way to go, and they said put. They said no word. So then, of course, the other people which are more, let's say, spregiudicati, they went for what seemed to be paying better in terms of election. And yes, the Tories went that way. So I agree with you. And from that, I tend to think that we could, we should, as it was suggested here, to look into populism as a phenomenon which should be carefully distinguished and giving this ideological and political roots and their alignment with certain problems typically of industrial decline, find a better picture of what that discontent is and how are these populist parties representing it. That's what I'm suggesting. Look at the roots, both ideological in terms of the parties and in terms of economic development roots, and that can give you a better understanding of populism and in which ways challenging the status quo. Now, yes.
Conception of development.
Conception of development. No, that was conception of development. Remind me to brief just 2 words of. Well, I have edited with my colleague a book titled Development Economics for the 21st Century. So there we pick the contribution of the development economics of the 50s and 60s and try to see in which way they can be helpful to look into the question today. So I can answer your question in 2 ways. One is returning to certain roots which have been largely forgotten in terms of the focus from the 60s, 70s on growth. Growth is typically aggregate. So from Solo's model on is growth, not development. Development has a part which is essentially centered on structural change. Changes in the composition of output and therefore composition of industry. That's a line which can help you to understand current problem. And in line with a revamping of certain ideas of the development economists of the 50s and the 60s, I just quoted Hirschman a moment ago. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question has also to do with what the 2 of you are asking. And it goes back to that question of the economic potential of lagging behind regions. So we are talking about not declining regions, not development gone bad. We are talking about the example in which, according to the idea of the economic backwardness, these regions are behind. Now, there is a problem with behind, because behind says, look, in the past, this has happened typically in the center. Should we reproduce the same path of development in the periphery? Not possible. But that's a fundamental idea, which is still there. Rodríguez-Pose goes a step forward because he poses the problem of the economic potential of lagging behind regions. So it does not call into question the concept of lagging behind, which is backwardness, which is questionable. But because it has in mind the idea of Rostow development, stages of development. First you develop in this way, and then in this way, and then this. So that repeating itself, which cannot be done because history goes through time. So, but aside from that, taking the good part, which is the economic potential, what I can say is not very encouraging, because the searching for this economic potential, as I briefly mentioned, has to do with the identification of things which have nothing to do with the, before it was industrialization. In the Italian Mezzogiorno, it was the creation of pole croissants, center of which would create development. Didn't work. So Rodríguez-Pose says that all the wrong things about policies about underdeveloped regions, which you can usefully read. But when it comes to discovering that potential to give opportunities, Well, I can only have referred to that problem in terms negative, unfortunately, when saying referring to the idea of strategies based on tourism and strategy based on typical products, small scale manufacturing, and handicraft tradition, local resources. It's not terribly clear what comes out of these things. So that's something for you to research, because these local mechanisms are not terribly convincing. It's unclear whether they can work. Rodríguez-Pose talks about place-sensitive solutions, not general policies of development, which have failed. But place-sensitive solution is a catchword, which is the starting point. In terms of focusing more precisely on initiative, we have the recipes which I have with these titles indicated. I'm not sure that we are far advanced in that direction, although it's a problem, obviously. And you have to be comfortable with that.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we have a couple of minutes left for more questions. Otherwise, we can end here. I think, of course, we should also interrogate ourselves about the pandemic, as the pandemic put an end to populism as we knew it within these 2 years. So what will happen if the pandemic ends, or what happens now with this populism we talked about over the last few years? Okay, thanks everyone for attending this seminar, and thank you, and bye-bye. Thanks, Professor Gualerzi.
Okay.
Sì, sì, è stato arrivato.